one of the most important things about spirituality is to get clear on what is my orientation. Is it being led around, kind of like a dog on a leash, by the endlessly unsatisfied, dissatisfied me with its almost endless array of problems and confusion? Is that what's dictating the orientation of my life, and in spirituality specifically of my spiritual life? It's really worth looking at. And I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't look at this closely is because it's very hard for them to even contemplate what I'm saying without being judgmental about what they find or feeling ashamed about what they find, right? So judgment and shame is one of the most powerful ways that the me orients all attention towards itself, right? Because then all of a sudden you're not really talking about anything other than trying to help the me feel better about itself. So just to notice that, or just to acknowledge it if it seems to be part of your experience. As I said, I think the proper orientation, even though the me or the psychological self will need to be dealt with, will be a part of one's life, one's spiritual life. But still, the question of what's my orientation? Now you notice that what could you say, the most forms of spirituality really at their heart have a transcendent orientation. And by transcendent, I don't mean to suggest that it's like some sort of getting lost in the clouds, not some sort of, not just populated with a bunch of spiritual fantasies. I don't mean transcendent in that way. And I don't mean transcendent in the sense of apart from. That's often a misunderstanding too. People are seeking to transcend so they can get away from. That's not really authentic transcendence, right? If you're just transcending something to get away from it, you may do that temporarily, but it's really not authentic. So in the end, it doesn't really end up working out very well, because eventually what you transcend, if there's a lack of resolution that's still there, it's going to keep pulling you back out of your kind of transcendent states. So I've really been focusing on this a lot this year. I am through a lot of the stuff that we've done, even the teachings that I've done quite a bit, even on the internet, around, looking at one of the ways we've looked at trying to establish a good orientation is to look at the values, for instance, that come directly from the deepest state of being: truth, love, compassion, clarity, service. There are any number of them. They're just sort of values that are inherent in being as such. Right? They're inherent in being. They're not necessarily inherent in ego, but they're inherent in the truth of being. And a good form of spirituality will give kind of voice and structure to those sort of self-transcending values. So I've talked about that any number of times, quite a bit this year. I'm just using that for an example. I'm not going to get into describing those at the moment. But I've noticed that even after people have had sometimes even very deep and very profound spiritual experiences, a lot of times, to a certain extent, they'll often still have some sort of struggle. It may be much subtler than after they had some big spiritual shift. But nonetheless, it's often still there between these two fundamental orientations. You see, because to give you an example of how the me orientation can still kind of get in there and dominate your spiritual life, even after you've had some big spiritual shift. The me comes in and says, I had this big shift last week or last year or whenever, and now what I want to have, because it's never fully satisfied, so now what I want to have is I want to be in that perspective that I realized last week. I want to have that wonderful feeling of expansion and wholeness and connection. I want to have that all the time. And that seems completely reasonable, doesn't it? Like, who wouldn't want that? And especially when you've had some of these deeper realizations, you know, the domains of consciousness that you can experience can be extraordinarily pleasant. And anything that's extraordinarily pleasant is highly addicting to the me, to the psychological self. So the psychological self, sometimes even after a big awakening experience, at some point will come in there and it'll say, here's what I want now. I had that experience. I want to live that all the time. I want to experience that. Not necessarily live it, but I want to experience it all the time. How do I stay in that experience? And like I said, it seems like a completely irrelevant question, but it's sneaky, because if you really look at that question, you realize that it's oriented around the me, or the psychological self. It's the me still looking for something. Now it's trying to hold on to a realization, right? And so if I as a teacher was just to say to someone, well, here's how you hold on to that experience you had last week all the time, I would just be playing into this me-oriented self, and this isn't really what the heart of spirituality is.